this conversation with culture-gentee Jason Motlagh. Am I pronouncing your last name correctly?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Jason is an award-winning journalist, photographer, and filmmaker whose work illuminates the complexities of conflict, culture, and human rights across the globe. I'm Essie Lynchner, Assistant Director at the Institute for Regional and International Studies National Research Center, also known as IRIS-NRC, and I'm very excited to welcome our featured guest, Jason. So I'm going to go ahead and read your bio so folks can know the breadth of all the important work you do. Jason is a journalist, photographer, and filmmaker drawn to challenging, underreported stories on the margins. A contributing editor at Rolling Stone, he was formerly Time Magazine's correspondent in Afghanistan, where he filed enterprise stories and video dispatches from around the country. He has traveled to more than 60 countries and covered conflicts in Latin America, Africa, the Mideast, and Southeast Asia. For National Geographic, Outside, Virginia Quarterly Review, The Washington Post, The Guardian, and The Economist. As founder of Blackbeard Films, he produces, directs, and hosts news documentaries for Al Jazeera English, National Geographic, Vice on Showtime, and others. Motlagh's feature documentary about the war in Afghanistan, Writers on the Storm, premiered in the 2023 South by Southwest Festival. His recognitions include a National Magazine Award, Overseas Press Club Award, George Polk Award, Sydney something award, and several more awards, and an Emmy. He lives in Baja, Mexico, with his wife and 2 sons. And before we begin, I also just want to quickly thank our co-sponsors for today's event for making this event possible. That is the Latin American, Caribbean, and Iberian Studies Program, the 4W Initiative, Women in Wellbeing in Wisconsin and the World, the International Division, and the School of Journalism and Mass Communications. And last but not least, the Fulton Center on Crisis Reporting for making today's event possible. So after all those introductions, welcome, Jason.
Thank you.
So excited. Start by just getting kind of a big picture of your journey to becoming a journalist, photographer, filmmaker. You do a lot. You cover many topics. So for those who are starting for the first time, can you give us more background, more detailed than the bio just read out loud?
Yeah, I didn't set out to become a journalist. I went to the University of Virginia, got a degree in foreign affairs, and to give you an idea, my first job at a university was as a commercial fisherman in Kodiak, Alaska, fishing salmon. And I might still be doing it. I love that job, but I had an injury on the job, and that forced me to reconsider, and I ended up applying for some internships that brought me back to Washington, and that's where I grew up, in D.C., Virginia. And I guess journalism always loomed as a prospect because I came from a family of journalists. My grandmother was a journalist. Her father was a nationally syndicated radio man. And so it was always kind of in the realm of possibility. I immediately fell in love with reporting, not so much in Washington, D.C. I didn't like covering internecine politics. I wanted to get away as far as I could from Washington. And at that point, then as now, people were basically writing the epitaph of foreign news coverage. The golden era of the foreign correspondent was over. Bureaus were shutting down. There was no money left in it. And people generally were very discouraging. So for me, I was not to be deterred, and I figured I could make up for what I lacked in experience and polish just by being in the right place. So I made a calculation to go to West Africa, which was kind of a vacuum in the global news landscape. And honestly, it was a mix of just a sheer adventure, exploring, and trying to find stories and place them along the way that brought me to West Africa and the Sahara. And as it happens, you sort of create your own luck. And I ended up being in a very obscure country called Mauritania when a coup happened, and I was the only correspondent for hundreds of miles. And suddenly editors were returning my emails. I was able to get some stories filed, and that was like the shot in the arm I needed at a very critical moment. And I think over the course of 6 to 8 months traveling around the region, I went from that fake it till you make it phase, which we all go through, to feeling like, oh, this is something I can do. I can make a go with this. Ended up working in 10 or 11 countries, and then got struck down by a really bad bout of malaria. Nearly finished me off and bounced back. And then ended up traveling to Europe, up to Scandinavia, overland through Russia, Mongolia, China, and came back to the US. Briefly took a staff job, instantly regretted it, getting back at the desk. And gosh, it's been 17 years now I've been a freelancer.
Wow. May I ask, speaking of creativity, can I ask how old you were when you started in Mauritania and reporting? And
Then 24, thereabouts.
I ask because I can't imagine being 24 and doing that, and it's just impressive, and I think it's inspiring to hear about people doing such amazing things at a young age. How, when, where did photography and filmmaking enter? Because most women in their lives try to become a filmmaker with films out. So how do you manage to do all of it, and when did that piece come in for you?
Yeah, I always writing kind of came first and foremost, but I never wanted to be pigeonholed as a writer. And I realized early on that, you know, if I could take reasonably good pictures along with the stories, that I was going to have better luck getting stories placed and just, you know, giving more value, right? I was a big deal because in the old days, you hire a writer and a correspondent, off you go, and you're having to pay for everybody. But I was holding 2 jobs for one. I was a bargain. And I also enjoyed it. You know, I like to mix it up. I like, you know, stepping back, doing the research, the analysis, sitting down with people at length and doing interviews that is essential to the reporting, but then just the sheer physicality, you know, having to go out in the world, looking for the good light, appraising the environment, and looking for good pictures. And so I took the boat, and that's not to say I was exceptional. You know, it's hard to be really good at everything. So I was definitely skewing more towards the writing. But I think it was also part of this natural progression because it became increasingly harder to make a living if you were limited to just filing stories. And so I, you know, being able to do visual media, you know, the photographs were a prelude to filmmaking. And I started to do more and more online videos. And the beginnings were very, very basic packages. And I had a soccer camera that I would shoot, and I would cut on Final Cut Pro and have to ingest the footage. And back in the day, you couldn't just, you know, dump it on your computer and go to work on the edit. You actually had to, like, in real time, just spend as much time uploading the footage as you did shooting it, which was really annoying. And then, you know, working in places like Afghanistan, dealing with power outages and bad internet, it was just very maddening. But learned the nuts and bolts of filmmaking, and then gradually started to produce short documentaries for international news outlets. And what a producer was, you know, essentially someone who was connecting the dots and telling a story. And then the stakes became bigger, and I moved on to hour-long films, and then more recently into feature filmmaking. So it's been a combination of both curiosity, but also necessity, because I don't think I'd been willing to be as versatile and try new things that I could have continued to work as a freelance journalist.
Right. It seems like you really forged your own path. Forget what degree you said you got in as an undergraduate.
Pretty useless foreign affairs degree.
Okay.
Yeah.
What skills did you learn? How did you learn how to do this? What skills best prepared you, whether it's a college degree, or it sounds to me like you picked up most of these skills while actually doing the work. So what about you makes you good at this, and how did you find these skills?
I think being dogged. It's really stubborn. You know, over the years I've met people who are, you know, better writers than me, who have a better mind for political analysis, you know, and for history. But you know, you have to show up. You have to go to these places and stick your neck out and do the work and have some skin in the game. I think that's been a big difference for me, and I was willing to do that for better or for worse, you know, from the beginning. Sometimes it's good when you're young, you don't know what you don't know. And I'm lucky along the way. But, you know, over time, you get experience and you hone your instincts, and those have served me really well. But I never got a fundamental education. You know, I learned a lot as an intern, which was great. I learned a lot more about storytelling as I started to write longer stories, doing narrative journalism, working with really talented editors who taught me, you know, how to structure a story, how to develop characters in a story, how to hold and, you know, seize and hold people's attention in the course of the narrative. That was years in the making. And, you know, I don't think I would have got there had I not been willing to continuously double down and take the initiative and go after these difficult stories. But it's been a work in progress, and it continues. And I think always trying to find a way to level up. You get to a point where you become proficient in something, and you can start to kind of phone it in. And so I've always been looking for opportunities to level up and find new challenges and test myself. We just put out a feature-length film. That wasn't a goal of mine early on. I never planned on that, but it was just part of this evolution. And like, I can keep, making films the same way, or I can really go all in and do something that is creatively a lot more challenging but liberating at the same time, and raise the bar. And I'm always looking for what's next.
Given that you forged your path at 24, going to Mauritania and West Africa, did you get into any trouble at any point? I'm just imagining a young, relatively inexperienced person out there going to conflict zones.
Yeah.
Curious, how did you navigate that?
All kinds of trouble, good and bad. Often as a freelance journalist, you're going to places without permission, right? You're going to tell stories about bad people doing bad things in the shadows, and they're not necessarily going to give you a visa and invite you in to do that. So it's sneaking across borders, which I've done for years and continue to do. The ends justify the means. Working in conflict zones, it's not something I've plunged into. Right? I gradually edged, into Afghanistan. This was at a time when Iraq was everybody's focus in the media. Things were relatively calm in Afghanistan, so it felt like a place where I could start to figure things out, get some experience and comfort working in a fluid environment. As the war intensified, I sort of grew with it. And so, I respect risk, I think. I've tried not to be out and right reckless over the years. There are times where that's certainly debatable. But that's a part of the job. I think it's unavoidable, but I've always tried to hedge my bets. There's so much of our ability to operate in these kinds of environments, even if you're very seasoned, it really depends on people you work with on the ground. And places like Haiti, Afghanistan, we rely wholly on local fixers, local journalists who have the lay of the land, who live this reality. And we are almost useless without these people to work with. And of course, we try and raise them up as we tell these stories and give them credit where it's due and advance their careers as well, because we rise and fall together.
Are these primarily locals?
Mostly locals, yeah. I mean, mostly local journalists. And Haiti's a good example. I first went there in 2006. Had a very difficult time. The gangs were problematic, but things were calm for a period, and they were having elections, and the UN was preparing to leave. And I met a local journalist there who was just starting out, and he's been there on and off ever since. And we went back in 2020 to do a film, and then back last year to continue coverage with a story for Rolling Stone, and might be exploring another film there. But I simply could not work effectively without this person on the ground guiding the way.
Nice. So speaking of Haiti, can you tell us more about the arc of your work there and the film, which I also watched? Tell us more about what's been going on there, and what has it been for you to watch, to be there to report on what seems to me a general worsening conditions over time.
Yeah, it's never been worse since I've been there. There was a period where things were pretty hopeful, and then what momentum was building was just completely waylaid by the earthquake in 2010. And ever since, you just had a series of feckless presidents and rulers in the country who have been enabled by the United States and other countries. These are governments that are very corrupt, that have effectively midwife the gangs that are now in power now. They're using the gangs as a tool to exert influence on the streets and sway elections their way, in the interest of a lot of these oligarchs who control the economy in the country behind the scenes. And what's happened now is those gangs have metastasized with American weapons that have been flooding into the country all these years, and now they've basically outgrown their political paymasters. So for the first time, the gangs are indisputably running most of.
How do those weapons end up there?
A lot of them come from Florida. These are U.S. weapons. Yeah, so they come in on flights, tucked into cargo shipments every which way. And Haiti has a vast coastline, so it's very corrupt, so it's very easy to get these weapons in. And there are a lot of senior political figures from the White House in Haiti all the way on down who have been implicated in these schemes of gun running, and being complicit in gun running and other devious things. And so, it's a scenario that has been abetted by people who are not only working in the best interest of the country and have had the backing of the U.S. government throughout. This knowledge is pretty well known. It's no secret, but people would rather keep up the charade of there being some semblance of a legitimate government rather than call it out for what it is. And so, we certainly bear some responsibility for what's happening in Haiti right now, and I think that's especially important to bear in mind as you see the right weaponizing a certain narrative around migrants, who are coming from Haiti to migrant hordes who are going to bring crime and a lot of problems to the United States, when we're very much connected to the turmoil that you see in Haiti. We have an open gun culture, and a lot of these assault rifles, military grade, are making their way onto Haitian streets. These are teenagers who can barely eat, but they have AK-47s, AR-15s. It's surreal, running around in flip-flops, shooting each other, killing a lot of people in the process. So, which is it going to be? And for me, going back, the Rolling Stone report in particular is just very bleak. There was no pretense of a solution. For once, academics, experts I spoke with didn't propose any kind of a silver bullet remedy to the situation. It's just like, we've never been in a place like this, and we're not sure how we're going to get out of it. And I wanted that to get across, because I want people here to understand, our role in Haiti's woes. One goes back a long time, but especially now, and that we need to humanize the people that are being affected by this, that are fleeing en masse from this violence, and taking this improbable journey down to South America and up to Central America to the United States in the hope of a better life, being met with a lot of resistance. Maybe give them the benefit of the doubt.
Thank you for saying that. So as an American, talking about America's influence in these geopolitics and in Haiti, how are you treated by the locals as an American? Or sort of what is the relationship between you as a reporter and U.S. involvement in the conflict? And how do you personally feel as an American doing this kind of reporting, knowing America's influence?
Yeah, in spite of some of the nativism on all sides that you see about migration, a lot of the Haitians love the United States generally. Not some of the policies and the interventions and the way they backfired, but a lot of them have family in the U.S. All the Haitians are all across the U.S., right? So there's an affinity there. I've always felt nothing but welcome. The violence, the gun battles aside, these are people who are taking me in at great risk, and I'm often under the charge of, whichever gang leader, community leader I'm dealing with, and they take responsibility very seriously. I wouldn't be otherwise allowed to operate and to interview people, and often dig up things that aren't necessarily flattering for them too. But I've been given that opportunity. I think especially now, because there's been such a vacuum of media coverage in Haiti, people are just so grateful to have some attention. Right?
Why do you think there's a vacuum?
That's emblematic of just global news in general, right? Everything's in recession. You just don't have foreign correspondents in places you used to. You would have someone full-time for events now. You might have an AP bureau that has a stringer, but you're not going to have a dedicated correspondent. That's just kind of across the board. And if you have a staff correspondent in a region, like probably a place like Mexico City, and they're only going to go if things get really bad. Now it's just gotten so prohibitive from a security standpoint that a lot of them can't even do that in their right mind. That some news organizations are so danger averse because of its cost and insurance premiums, that they won't even send their people. So to give you an idea, when we were in Port-au-Prince, just on our own, the only other reporting crew that I knew that came, in a month before or after our trip was from Al Jazeera. And they came in, with armored vehicles, a crew of former foreign legionnaires, armed to the teeth to protect them, bulletproof vests. I mean, they're coming in almost like special forces, right? Maybe it keeps them safe, from when the bullets fly, but ultimately I think that's an encumbrance. You're coming in with all this, heavy armor, and it shows a very kind of standoffish posture in a way, and it's just very loud. And can you really talk to people comfortably, right, when you're coming in hot like that? I think it makes it very difficult. And so for me and the people I work with, I've always valued agility and a light footprint, being able to go in and not being reckless again. There are times when I've certainly donned body armor, but making reasonable decisions around that, and showing people before showing up. And I think when they see that you're willing to bear some of the same risks that they live every day, that really resonates with them. And that's where the trust and the intimacy, ultimately the better reporting, come from. And that has worked for me, I think, throughout my time.
How do you decide where to go report?
I've moved all over the board. I've told some classes, that's for better and for worse. Like, there's definitely something to be said for staying in one place and investing and building long-term relationships and having a beat, right? You really get to know things at a granular level and track the ups and downs. I haven't really done that, with the exception of maybe Afghanistan. I think there are sort of patterns I've had in my reporting, but I think I've been more drawn by certain kinds of stories, often stories that are undercovered. Early on, I just sort of set out to go a different direction from the pack where possible. It's not to say I don't also go to places that other journalists go to, but it's a big world, right? And if everyone is preoccupied with what's happening in Ukraine, I've been to Ukraine, but I haven't gone to cover the war because there's more than enough people covering the war in Ukraine. That story gets quite repetitive, right? Gaza is just difficult, so what more can I add that local journalists are not getting out on social media and other channels? So that's why I go to places like Haiti or Myanmar, which are definitely not first in line in the priorities list of editors, but these are places where catastrophic things are happening. Hundreds of thousands of people are being displaced. In Myanmar, a lot of war crimes multiply in the dark, and they're there to be covered. Why are they not being covered? Often it's, and this is the sad thing about the way news is covered right now. What relevance do they have to the US audience? That's a constant refrain from editors. So you have to keep that in mind. There's still some outlets that are more omnivorous, like Al Jazeera, thankfully. They send me to obscure parts of Myanmar or elsewhere to do these stories, but it's harder and harder to get those stories placed. And so one thing that I've had to do is find that American or Western hook, right? So I was moved to go back to Myanmar last year because I was hearing a lot of terrible things were happening, atrocity crimes. Very difficult to get anyone to send me, even with my experience. So I had to find an American connection, and I found a really compelling character, the leader of a renegade humanitarian group. He's American, former Special Forces operative, also a pastor. So I think like Captain Kurtz, Captain Fantastic kind of guy, raising his family in the jungle. Right? That's a really interesting story. And so that's what I pitched, and that's how I got the story approved and was able to get a grant from the Pulitzer Center, which has supported me consistently over the years to go to reporting. Spent almost a month in the bush with these guys, and was able to do a story on a country that is completely out of the news cycle, at least in the United States and in the West. And that's often what it takes.
So I suspect we do have some day school students or students who are interested in becoming reporters. And I'm curious, what can you tell them, given the changing media landscape in general? There's a lot of ominous headlines about that, but specifically, given what you just said about the lower interest in international topics. So other than like it's important work that should be done, what words of encouragement might you have for aspiring journalists who want to do these kinds of stories internationally?
I've been heartened to see how many students are in these journalism programs. We had great discussions in the classes that I visited, and I think everyone was as well aware as I am of the landscape out there. And that's really good to see, that in spite of all the naysaying, the same thing that I dealt with early on, if anything, it's only intensified. I think I mentioned one study was in the Wall Street Journal that your career prospects as a reporter were like ranked second to last, to like lumberjack or something like that. Like it's really bleak out there, and yet students are showing up and getting the education, and so I just have to believe that we'll continuously find a way, whether it's new media platforms, podcasts. Better quality, YouTube channels, things like that. It might not look anything like we're used to. The mainstream media is definitely withering, and there's a lot of mistrust around it. Not all undeserved, but I think it's going to continue to evolve. It really has to. One positive is the ascendancy of nonprofits to step in and fill the void, like the Pulitzer saying. I think they saw the writing on the wall early on. So much of the most meaningful, in-depth reporting that I've done, they have supported. I wouldn't be anywhere near where I am without their support. And they have only grown. It's now like a global organization. I think other organizations are coming together to continue to support in-depth investigative reporting, to backstop local newsrooms, whether it's all over the country and elsewhere. So I think that's promising, and that there's still students coming through the pipeline who are ready to take on that responsibility. It gives me some hope, but they have to be tenacious as hell. It's never been easy. It's only going to get harder. There's a lot of disappointment. There's a lot of rejection, and you have to develop very thick skin along the way. But if you do, I think you have the potential for a very extraordinary, meaningful life.
That's a great answer. Can you tell us more about your work in Afghanistan?
Anything specific? There's a lot.
Well, I'm curious about like your history of going there to report. Like, what did it start, and are you still going back? Yeah. And then I know that you have this amazing film, Riders of the Storm, which is very interesting. I'll let you describe what it's about. Yeah. But I'm curious to hear just about the arc of your time in Afghanistan, and how did you come about making this film, and maybe share what the film is about.
Yeah, I first went to Afghanistan. I was briefly on staff at might be finally dead UPI Newswire, and my boss sent me because he knew I was going to quit if I didn't go to Afghanistan. I was just chomping at the bit to get out of the office, and I went to Afghanistan. I quit. I was done, and went back. I remember I went to an editor at the Washington Times. Not the most auspicious beginning, but there was a very cool foreign editor there. And I told him I wanted to go. I was going, and wouldn't give me any money. And he gave me $1,200, which almost bought me a ticket to Afghanistan, but that was all I needed. And off I went, and kind of figured it out from there. But it's a country I immediately fell in love with, just because it was so unlike anywhere I had ever been. It really is like stepping back in time, and everything is just so visceral, and I think the culture also resonated with me a lot because my father's from Iran, and I had never been to Iran before, and so there was a proximity. It wasn't entirely unfamiliar. Of course, the language of Dari is a cousin of Farsi, and so I enjoyed exploring that. And then just started to build really good relationships and got hooked into the stories. And all the while, the Taliban was resurgent and things were getting worse. And, as sad as that is, it had been more work. Like, things picked up. The attention of news outlets sort of swung from Iraq back to Afghanistan, and Obama doubled down, and there was the surge. I got some grants from the Pulitzer Center to examine the toll of civilian casualties from airstrikes, which were happening with great frequency, US airstrikes. And I felt like Western coverage, just tended towards statistics, but you weren't really getting a sense of the impact this was having on people, hearts and minds, right? And how they supported this whole effort. And people forget there was a period early on that, Afghans who were notoriously averse to outsiders meddling in their affairs were really open to foreign assistance, money, and reconstruction. That was playing out after all these decades of relentless war. And there was hope. And that was being squandered with these airstrikes, and insurgents were multiplied as a result. So I was really trying to emphasize that, get that point across. And that only continued to spiral with time. All the while, looking at the gloom and doom of the war, I wanted to share with people this fascinating culture that I was getting immersed in. And one aspect of that really struck a chord with me was Buzkashi, which is the national sport. It's an ancient game, kind of called goat polo, said to date back to the time of the Mongols. And basically, it's men on horseback battling for control of a headless goat, which is the game ball. It's quite brutal, but it is in a lot of ways also a metaphor for the way power is wielded in Afghanistan. And to me, just a fascinating lens into the different ethnic traditions and some of the strongmen that were behind the scenes and pulling strings in the government and in the provinces. And so I gradually got deeper access into this world. And in 2016, after I left, I was living in Afghanistan for a few years, and I was kind of burned out, so I took a break and I went back. So I was just raring to do this story, a lengthy magazine story, looking at the politics of Buzkashi and actually trying the game myself. Not so great results, but came away from that trip just thinking, wow, this really has to become a film because it's so visual, so much action, and it's never been done really the way it could be done. And so this passion project took hold, and me and my partner started saving from some of these news documentaries that we were doing. We had this little slush fund. And then late 2020, on the heels of another documentary, right as the US is starting to, has announced its withdrawal, right? So the Taliban is really pushing on the gas now, going on the offensive, and things are crumbling. You can see where it's all headed. We knew the timing was right. The ground was shifting beneath everybody's feet. Meanwhile, you've got these warlords who are hosting these really over-the-top tournaments and in the cities and kind of aloof to what's happening in the backcountry, and it felt like this bubble was just about to burst. So through local contacts, I was able to meet some of the players who were kind of looking for a star, who would lead the film, and we found him, and we knew this was our guy. Everything just kind of unfolded from there. And, no one was going to hold our hand at that point, right? Trying to explain how a film about men on horseback battling for a headless goat relates to politics. It was just too much to sell a Netflix executive, right? Not a lot of imagination. So we ended up having to just fund ourselves to the tune of many tens of thousands of dollars, just all in on this project. Because we knew if we pulled back, we were going to miss critical moments, given how fast things were transpiring. And we just kept going back, and then eventually the Taliban took over the country, and our stars had to be evacuated, and the rest is history. But we were able to get Red Bull, a major production company, to come in and compensate us for our time and investment, and then finish the film and get it out into the world. So yeah, it was a hugely gratifying project, the biggest thing I've ever undertaken to date. And yeah, it's what leaves you thinking, well, what next? Barely pulled that off. It was all in, and it was awesome to see it realized.
Yeah, it's a very impressive project. I'm curious, I know I was slightly hesitant to feature it big and loud because of the distastefulness of the goat head. Curious to what degree was that a barrier for the folks for Redbull, for other partners you're talking to? How did you kind of get past that piece?
Could be a factor. I mean, we still don't have distribution in the US. And I think part of that is a function of just the bottom dropping out of the streaming boom. And so everybody's struggling in the documentary sphere. There was a time when these streaming services were just commissioning left and right, something for everybody. That golden age is over. So we were fortunate in the sense that we got the film commissioned and finished, but the timing for the release was kind of terrible. That may be a factor. I think the biggest thing that worked against us was just the simple fact of being in a foreign language. And that was by design. You know, we didn't want to do just another film through, you know, the lens of the American troops and the white savior and all that. This was going to be an Afghan-centric film, really immersed in the experience of ordinary Afghans, and you're going to see the culture peel back in a way that you haven't seen it before. And I think we largely pulled that off. But as far as marketability, subtitles, not everybody's favorite flavor right now. That's what we've been told. So, you know, these things have a life of their own. The film was picked up in France. Hopefully some more countries pile on. It might eventually go to the VOD in the near future. And so we'll all be able to see it. And here's to more things.
Is it true that anyone can see it right now if you go to the website? Or?
No, you can't see it now. I mean, I'm happy to share the link as long as you don't pirate or pass it on. But you could subscribe to Canal Plus streaming service. Do a trial. It's probably a free trial. You can watch it on there. But it's called, that's not, the film is Riders on the Storm, reference to the Doors song. I think it's, in French, it's Cavalier de la Liberté or something. The Riders of Freedom.
We'll share a link to that and everything else we discussed. And I'll
I can share a trailer too if anyone wants to see it.
Yes. Yeah. So I'll come out and post about, for those of you wondering how to get your hands on that. Myanmar. I want to ask you about your reporting there. Is that the one where the American former general is helping train?
This is the humanitarian.
Yes.
Yeah.
Can you tell us more about that story? How much time have you spent there? You've gone more than once. Do you have another film project related to that? Maybe? Yeah. Yeah,
so I first went in 2011, I think it was. And it was actually a really cool, unusual assignment, not as dark and heavy as I'm used to. I had an editor who loved the country. He did a book on the Burma Road from World War II. And he sent me to get on an old riverboat and ride a big stretch of the Irrawaddy River, which is the main artery down the center of the country. So it was like a travel kind of piece. And I just brought my camera and went with a friend. And it was beautiful. I mean, we're just on this boat going 5 miles an hour very slowly for a couple of weeks. I was the only foreigner on this boat. A lot of migrant farmers, families, soldiers on leave, just a cross section of the culture and ethnicities. And I was just having casual conversations, eating tea-leaf salad on the top of the boat, trying to avoid the advances of the local police captain who's just getting me drunk every day. And it's funny because on this seemingly very lighthearted trip, I got wind of the wars that were playing out in the hinterlands. And I was aware that there were all these insurgencies, ethnic groups battling the ethnic majority for their share of the pie all around the country. But I wasn't well versed. And as it happens on the boat, in the berth right next to us, I'd just be hearing constant moaning. And finally I popped my head in and the whole place was spiderwebbed with gauze and fabric, and there were these soldiers who had been shot fighting insurgents in Kachinstan in the north. And I very tactfully, through my interpreter, started a conversation with the officer who was sort of minding it. And, this is a very low-grade military. They didn't have the means to medevac these soldiers to a hospital in Mandalay, which is the largest city in the center-north of the country. And so they were having to take this boat at a snail's pace down the river to get to the hospital. And that really opened my eyes. And I was intrigued and started to look more into this war in Kachin State, and then decided to go back and produce a film to Al Jazeera, which was a game to fund something in Kachin State. And just the logistics of getting there helped me realize why there was such a dearth of coverage. And this involved, as the crow flies, maybe traveling 50 miles from where I was at that point to get into the conflict zone. But in this event, I had to go back down to Mandalay, to Rangoon, to Guangdong, Shanghai, Beijing, back to southwest China. It was this huge roundabout way, and then sneak across the border in China, cross a river, and then get in with the rebels, right? All while dodging like Chinese patrols. And I don't even think you can do it very easily anymore. But I was able to get into Kachin and spend 3 weeks with the rebels, and met a lot of displaced people and victims from the war who were just constant shelling and bombardment. It really opened my eyes to the struggle of these different ethnic minorities and just how long this persecution had gone on. And of course, from there, I found out about other fights in Karen State, Karenni State, and Arakan State. So that was very sobering for me. And I continued to go back and do some proof reporting in Kachin and elsewhere. And then 2018, 2019, I started to see these really terrible attacks against the Rohingya minority in Arakan State. And this is a stateless minority that essentially has no rights in the country and has been persecuted as long as anyone can remember. And we were seeing large-scale atrocity crimes, villages being torched, mass rapes, and so on. And the military was just kind of upping the ante. It looked like ethnic cleansing was underway. And sure enough, it was. And meanwhile, there was just this dithering by the UN and the international community, which was still sort of beholden to this pretense of democracy that the country was experimenting with, and paying lip service to all these international rules and speaking out of the side of their mouth, and enabling effectively the military to pursue this strategy. And it all culminated in what we now call genocide. So I was not in Arakan, but on the Bangladesh side, reporting from these camps as they started to swell, and waves of people were crossing in. And it was just some of the most egregious things I've ever seen, unimaginable. Just the wounds that these people had, the stories of their children being beheaded, and thrown, heaped in the bonfires. Awful things. And so Mark, my partner, and I ended up doing a series for Al Jazeera, and then also did a big feature for Rolling Stone, just to try and get the word out. And it was infuriating because it felt like this was a slow motion genocide that could have been averted with forceful action at the right time. It was just enabled in return by politicians and lack of will. And I think that's one of the things you reckon with doing this kind of work, whether you're in the aid sector or a journalist. You come in with certain ideals and you have beliefs in a system, and you see how the systems often function and that they fail. They don't do what they're supposed to do. And this continues to play out. So that said, it's still important that the effort is made and that these stories are told, if not to effectuate a response in real time, for the record. Because I think it's important to keep records, and if we don't learn from them now, we can learn from them in the future. And without it, the worst things will continue to happen. Shadows.
I do have another question for you, but before I ask it, I just want to let everyone know that you can raise your hand in just a few moments with any questions you have, and those joining us via Zoom, please add your questions in the chat. And Chinad just raised, I guess, let me know if there's anything you want to bring us in that. And so while you're thinking about your questions, thinking of the dark, you have to witness some pretty awful stuff in your reporting. And I'm curious, how do you process witnessing so many atrocities? I was talking to the parents of the deceased children, the children. How do you maintain your own emotional well-being given all of that? How do you maintain the purpose and hope in your work, given that it involves looking at the face of some pretty awful facts?
Yeah, there was a time where I was not very skillful at that, and I'm in a very good company. And, that created a lot of complications in my life, just trying to stay ahead of it. And continuously thrusting yourself into these crises and letting other people's pain drown out whatever you're carrying with you. But eventually it catches up, and it catches up in usually very dramatic ways. And there was a period where I struggled. There was depression and a lot of poor choices, reckless decision making. But I pulled out of it, and I think now one is just being able to talk about it. And I think there's been a good shift within the media in general to open a conversation around this, put it on the table. The old cliche of like correspondents, just washing it all away at the bar and laughing it off, and that's kind of played out. And it doesn't end well. It doesn't age well. And so I'm happy to see how things have evolved there. There are more resources available to journalists, able to reach people in conflict zones. But ultimately, the responsibility is yours. And I try and, for used to pull back or avoid or recede, I try to kind of lean into it. And even if it feels a little forced, just opening up about what I've been experiencing. Often that's best done among peers, right? Because you're not speaking to someone who just doesn't have the range of experience to begin to appreciate what you're talking about, which can be very frustrating, but people who have walked the same walk, who you respect, just being able to hold space and hear each other out goes a long way. So I have a group of people that I can lean on for that, and vice versa, and that's been hugely helpful for all of us. And then, just more basic things, just taking better care of yourself, no drinking, training, sleeping, breathing, breath work, all those good things we hear about on social media. Super helpful. So yeah, there's a lot that has changed, and I need that because I couldn't continue to do this otherwise. I couldn't be able to do this as long as I have without investing in that. And fortunately, I have an extraordinary partner who allows me to continue to do this work, fundamentally understands why I do it, believes in it, but who also keeps me very honest about my intentions. It's got a great cover story, right? You're going out to the world, risk your neck to help people, give a voice to the voiceless, all those platitudes. And yes, there is a lot of good in that. But you can also lie to yourself and just get addicted to the intensity. And that can backfire in very unfortunate ways. And so just being honest about that and having people in your life that are honest with you and will call you out if you're kidding yourself and trying to get them. So I rely on my wife for that. I know she's got my best interests at heart.
Great. Thank you so much. I have so many more questions. This has been amazing. So. Now, time for questions from the audience here or joining from home. Looks like you might have our first one.
Oh, thank you.
I want to turn on the lights.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, whatever happened to Baby Claude Duvalier? I know he finally returned to Haiti, and he sort of dropped out of the picture after that.
Yeah, he left. I mean, he went into exile.
Right.
And I think he's passed away. I don't know if he was in France initially or where he went. I'm not. Is anyone else here now?
No, he was in France,
yeah.
And then he came back to Haiti.
Yeah, and he's no longer in Haiti. I think he passed away. Yeah, Baby Doc, the son of the Duvalier dictatorship. the lady for many years, and his father, Papa Doc, was the first. Junior took over and was arguably worse.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Okay. So you're moving around all the time. How does creating community come at kind of how do you create community when you're moving around all the time, especially with language barriers and coming back to the US and traveling to Mexico right now? Yeah.
Yeah.
How does that come at it? I want to say the word toll, but I don't think that's the right word.
But there is this kind of community, which is cool, right? And working all these places, journalists or people who have worked in the field, and so I feel like I've got a home, all over the world.
Yeah.
And more often than not, it's virtual, and like you can spend years just swapping messages on email, and then suddenly something pops off, and there's a story, and it's like, hey, and it's all good, it's understood. Back to work and just sort of hit the ground running. Yeah, that was, for me, I was itinerant for so long, moving around different cities, and just constantly on the move. And 7 years ago, we moved down to Mexico. And finally, for the first time in my life, I found a sense of community, a place that just suits us and gives me like the peace and calm and space that I think I need, which is very much an antidote to all of this intensity and movement and action. And that's been very helpful in deepening, and connecting with people and building a family and all of that. Yeah, having friends who aren't necessarily like doing this kind of work, just locals, some of the stuff, going to the coffee shop and running into people that are familiar that we don't know that well. But I've really enjoyed that, and it's been like just the environment.
We're in the Baja.
Southern end of the peninsula, about an hour north of Cabo.
El Rosario.
Further south, yeah, way down about 22 hours from there.
You mentioned you're from the DC area. I'm curious where specifically, and did that influence at all, like why you wanted to get into conflict reporting and stuff growing up there?
Yeah, so I grew up in DC in Northwest, in Georgetown, and then was in Northern Virginia at Falls Church for middle and high school. Yeah, I'm sure just being in the orbit of Washington, and you're reading the Washington Post every day, made a huge impression. Right? Like, had I been in deep Virginia, maybe a little different.
Yeah.
And just having access to museums and speakers who are coming in and things like that, I think that all probably played a role. And yeah, I mean, certainly when I went back as an intern, that to me I took as a sign. It was like I applied for these internships and I got two, and they were both in DC. I was like, okay, this is destiny. Try this on. It was the right move. Nice Iversons, by the way.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Yeah. People say a lot of the time that history is something that we can kind of learn from, and like effectively your stories will become historical documentation of events that are happening right now. So with that, how do you want your readers to take the stories that you're getting and use them as a way to learn for their future, the way that they act?
Yeah. No, I mean, it's nice sometimes, the reporting actually does become part of the record, or, ideally in cases, right? Like right now, some of the work is being used in the ICJ case against Myanmar. So I'm dealing with lawyers, and they're going back and pouring over interview transcripts, and they're using that to build a case against the government for its genocide. So that happens. That's great. I think for me, my reporting, there's always politics in the mix, but it's been less about, say, political analysis and projection, and I've always been more drawn to the human experience and just trying to pierce people's consciousness about what others on the other side of the world, in a place they might not be able to find on a map or experience, and finding a way to bridge that gap and help them relate just a little bit. I think that is ultimately what drives me, and so I try and appeal to the heart as much as the mind, and make it feel as personal as I can. I think that's been pretty consistent, at least in the last 10 years or so, as I've been able to explore more long form narrative reporting. In the news reporting, there's just so many ways you can skin it. There are limits. You're pressed for space. But being able to tell long narratives, that's really what what people are going through, check back with them. There's like a trajectory to their experience, and you can also infuse it with more context and nuance, and that's why I do it, to be able to tell those kinds of stories. So yeah, I think once you've had a good soak with a story like that, like hopefully you come away thinking just a little bit differently. Maybe you don't get something quite the same if you count it, but maybe, you know, that reflexive, hardened view you've had for so long about a given issue, I just shifted.
I know you already kind of answered this, but when you went to West Africa when you were 24, I'm so curious, like, what was going on in your head, and like what led up to that after your undergrad? Because like 24 and going there, like, I don't know.
I was so stoked, you know. I read a couple of memoirs about correspondents who worked in Africa. I was also growing up a big fan of Ryszard Kapuscinski, who was a Polish, calling him a journalist is not fair, he was much bigger. I mean, he had the acumen of a novelist in his reports. He was a guy who's running for the Polish press agency, which has no money. And basically his mandate is he has to cover the continent of Africa. So he had to use a lot of resourcefulness and be very evocative, and just he had an extraordinary talent for bringing this continent to life beyond the facts, right? And it inspired me a lot. So I kind of had these things dancing around my head going back. But no, like I said, it was part like, okay, I'm going to try and prove myself as this upstart journalist, but also just adventure. Like I was in Myanmar after I finished reporting on the coup in Mauritania. I went and got on this iron ore train. Ever heard of this thing? You guys should YouTube it, because now it's like one of those, like, the world's got a lot smaller because of Instagram, but back in the day it was this legend, you know, it was this northern city you get on and you get on the train. It's an open flatbed train that brings iron ore from the mine deep in the Sahara Desert, several thousand miles. And there's a place in the middle of the desert where it stops to like round this bend, and you can hop on and catch a free ride. So, you know, we went and did that, right? And spent the night blowing in the wind on top of the iron ore train. I mean, I was always looking for those kinds of experiences too.
Is that the one that begins on the coast of Nuwadibo?
Wow. That's impressive. Nuwadibo, you're the only other person who's ever known that. Yes, Nuwadibo to Attar, and then Zurat is where the mine is. It's just a mine in the middle of nowhere. Right. You look on a map, and yeah, there's like a passenger car in the back, but that's no fun. Hop on, it slows down at the elbow and ride all the way. Oh, wow. We got there black as night. It looked like we had like, it was like a bank robbery gone wrong, but it was wild. You know, and that's what I wanted. I wanted fresh experiences, just something that, you know, I could never do back home.
Did you go just by yourself? Or?
So for that period of the trip, I was traveling with another American. Okay. And I told, you know, he knew what I was trying to do, and he said, "That's cool. Like, can we go together?" And we just kind of struck a partnership, and it was good because we got into some dodgy situations, and he was a good guy, a judo champion, so he kind of had my back. Yeah, we were good companions.
Real quick, do we have any questions in the chat by chance?
One, but it's not really relevant.
Okay. Well, just a reminder for those joining via Zoom that you can ask your questions in the chat, and John will get them out loud. So, in the meantime, I'll go to.
Well, you know, a lot of the stuff you cover is kind of heavier, and like a lot of experiences are not always like most fun to live, but what are some like lighthearted kind of memories that you cherish, like you got to experience that you value today?
Train, yeah. But under the rubric of journalism, certainly that boat ride, right? And especially seeing what's happening in the country right now. This civil war has just blown out in the open, so it's gone from these borderlands into the lowlands. So I couldn't do that. You can't undertake that journey anymore. After the Taliban took over, as bleak as that was, they were so disorganized that there was a moment where you could travel pretty freely around the country. So a photographer friend and I did a story for National Geographic where we drove ourselves 2,000 miles around the country on this highway, which was surreal because we were able to go to places that for the previous 20 years were just inaccessible, too dangerous, off limits. And yeah, it was just like with a sense of wide-eyed wonder, getting to explore this country, emerging from all these years of conflict. Sure enough, that's another trip you couldn't do right now because there are a lot more swirling about security and where we can and can't go. So that was a really, really cool trip. Yeah, just spending time with the horsemen, the plains in the north, and trying my hand at Buzkashi, which was real. I'm very lucky. I kept all my teeth. I've got a huge respect for how difficult that game is, and I would do it. Yeah, things like that. I mean, just and then the crazy thing is often it's like it's going into these places that are ostensibly off limits because of conflict. That sometimes the natural wonders are kind of protected in a way because you can't have hordes of tourists showing up and builders and developers coming in to spoil it. They're insulated from that to a degree, so it can be bittersweet. And I've had these really just beautiful experiences in the most unlikely places as a result. Last time in Myanmar, like doing the story with this humanitarian group and traveling around these militia and then going to these swimming holes and waterfalls, right? That like no one's ever really gets to, and just kind of pitching yourself that you're oblivious and you have it all to yourself. That's
questions. Let's go to Jack.
Where would you hope to go next that you haven't been?
I really want to go to Namibia, but I'm having a hard time cooking up a good excuse to send me there. Yeah, it's a place I always wanted to just go and wander. Milan is another one. Not war zones, there are places that are pretty calm. Kyrgyzstan, yeah, open spaces.
Molly, go ahead and then.
Was there ever a story for you that you felt had an unexpected impact or that had a reaction from people that you weren't anticipating or maybe intending when you wrote it?
Sure. I mean, impact is so elusive, right? And it's like rare is the story that like just you can make a direct line from its publication to a president stepping down. I mean, that's like everybody's fantasy, but there was an investigation I did in 2012 in Thailand into migrant labor in the shrimp packing industry. And a lot of Burmese migrants were being exploited. And there were a lot of children in the industry, and they were especially prized because they have small hands and they work really fast. A lot of sexual abuse, physical abuse, things going on in these factories. And they were suppliers, subcontractors to major US seafood purveyors. The trouble was, a lot of the inspectors would go into the larger factories, but they weren't doing their diligence of going into these smaller factories that were supplying the larger ones. And so they didn't ultimately get to the root of the problem. And so we spent like painstaking weeks finding these facilities and then tracking the places we knew child laborers were working, and then having to monitor like physical shipments going from smaller factories to bigger ones, and then getting blended in with the export shrimp and making the way to Red Lobster and Costco and a lot of brands that we know. So we were able to like connect those dots and verify it. And the reporting came out in like NewsHour, the Post. It's a package, and it's like a host of buyers ended up canceling their contracts. And it was part of a groundswell of other reporting. That's often the effect it has. Is other people follow when it drops in a bucket, and that's what sort of precipitates change. And that's exactly what it did. So it's not to say there still aren't wholesale abuses in this industry, but it's really cleaned up its act, I think, compared to that time. And so that was just one of those times where it actually had a tangible effect.
Yeah.
Sure.
Have you gotten pushback from like governments, like feel like actual like physical threats or something? Or verbal?
Can't say I have. Well, that's kind of in the case of Thailand, right? Because a lot of these factory owners were connected to politicians. So there was some ruckus around that. I did cause a stink in Afghanistan when I did some reports that were very critical of the Polish forces in one of the provinces. And yeah, the foreign ministry was very unhappy. Felt it was unfair that I was picking on them. But I mean, it was just bluster, you know, never any kind of legal threats or anything of that nature.
I kind of have a similar question. I think I might not come back to this, but in Haiti, you said you had connections to gangs or like staying at houses or something like that. How does your reporting maybe kind of challenge your relationships with people if it's maybe putting them in not so great of a light? I'm not sure who these people are, like what they actually do in the day-to-day, but yeah, have your relationships with the people that you connected with in the countries that you're staying in been kind of tarnished or like broken because of the reporting that you're doing?
Yeah, good question. So I think it was Janet Malcolm, New Yorker writer, who said something to the effect of, you know, reporting is the act of betrayal. And there's some truth to that. You know, you spend this time kind of ingratiating yourself to the subjects, and often on the pretense that, you know, you're going to do something that's in their interest, which is flattering. It often doesn't break that way. Yeah. In Haiti, you know, in the case of this story, barbecue, you know, I had to point out a lot of the criminal allegations against him. Yeah. Fortunately, like, he's a pretty literate guy in the sense that he's, you know, he expects that. He understands how reporting is done, and that, you know, it can't just be a PR puff piece and, you know, parroting everything that he's telling me. That's part of the deal. And so that was not in any way a deal breaker. You know, there was no sort of blowback after the story. This is, I'm talking about the film we did in 2020. After that reporting came out, and, you know, so much that he actually felt like we did right by him so far as we gave him ample time to communicate his ideas and speak for himself, and we didn't spin it in any way. So I think that's your responsibility as a journalist, right? It's not to say you don't have a point of view, or you're not orchestrating the story in a way that is, you know, trying to advance a certain thesis around that. But yeah, fortunately, that was not a deal breaker, and so much so that we were able to go back, and, you know, he brought us in again, this time even closer to do the story for Rolling Stone. You know, it could be our next film project. So yeah, hopefully you're dealing with people that know you're at least operating in good faith, and you have responsibility as a reporter to point out the allegations and things like that, but you're going to give them a fair shake.
Right. So it's kind of about maintaining the integrity of what they're saying, but also having just like a respectful conversation. Yeah, it's like the integrity of what they're saying, but also your own integrity by acknowledging these other things that have happened. I
think we have time for just one more question.
So, thanks. Yeah, I was curious, what other African countries have you been in or reported on?
They're mostly West Africa and North Africa. So yeah, Egypt, Senegal, Mali, Ivory Coast, also Cameroon. Yeah, but there's still a lot more to explore. I haven't been in East Africa. To do that, I'd love to go to Namibia, South Africa.
Might suggest also West Sahara,
I did go through West Sahara.
Oh, you did?
Yeah, that was on the way down to Mauritania.
Uh-huh.
I left that out. But that was a treacherous crossing. We're on top of a Bedford van, and you're going off piste. The road isn't paved at that point. And you see all these blown-up vehicles that have hit landmines.
Oh,
It's like,
wow.
okay, don't go there. We're trying to like thread this thing. We're clutching the grill on the roof of the van, so in case anything happens. Things you do in your 20s.
Yeah.
Well, Jason, thank you so much. I could easily keep going with many more questions here. And are you okay with just staying a few minutes after we're done, just in case there are other questions from the audience?
Yeah, sure. If there are any journalists who would be in the crowd, I'm happy to share an email.
This has been really informative and amazing. So thank you again. We'll send out a post-event email with today's recording and links to all your current projects. Speaking of, is there anything you want to plug real quick at the end here? Something you're working on right now, or something you want to direct people to?
Well, there's nowhere to direct them yet, but we do have this short doc on Haiti. It's a profile of this gang leader, and we're putting that together for a new series that's going to roll out on Australia called Documentary Plus. I've been familiar, but that should be in the next month to 2 months. So keep an eye out for that.
Okay, thanks so much.